Three, two, one. What's going on, everyone? You're watching Ash on Comics. My name is Ash, and here is today's comic, The Last God, Book 1 of the Fellspire Chronicles. This is a book that I almost overlooked. I love fantasy. I love dark fantasy in particular. I'm a big fan of fantasy worlds like Warhammer Fantasy and Diablo, if you're familiar with those. Lord of the Rings, of course, is an all-time classic. But I don't typically read or gravitate towards fantasy stuff on the comics. For whatever reason, I don't feel comics have ever delivered, or I should say rarely deliver, a good experience in this genre or this medium. I don't know why that is. I'm not really trying to suggest that it can't or it does. A lot of people love it. I mean, Conan seems to be as popular as ever, and that's great. It's just, for whatever reason, I prefer to consume that in the form of film and novels. But this book kind of caught my eye. I like the name, The Last God. I think names are really important. Book 1 of the Fellspire Chronicles, I think, is a little bit too... It should have just been called The Last God. I hate when they put too many subtitles and nonsense to stuff. Just make it simple. The Last God. Done. Anyways, this is a DC Black Label book. Seems like half the stuff coming out of DC is Black Label these days. It's like a catch-all. It used to be, like when it first launched, it was going to be the premier prestige format, sort of like the top shelf version of the DC comics. And now it's just sort of the catch-all for anything that doesn't fit in the normal DC universe. And so that's kind of sad. It waters down the label, but you're not really here for that. Let's talk about this book. First of all, I'm going to spoil this book. As I always do. If you've watched my show, you're like, okay. And I don't really want to spoil this for you. This was a really good experience. I really enjoyed this book. It's really well done. And if this sort of thing is your cup of tea, if you look at this and say, oh, well, I'm Ash, I am into fantasy comics. Like, I want more. Then don't really watch any more of this video. Go pick this book up. If you are, like I said, if you are a person who likes fantasy in comics, like sword and sorcery type stuff in comics, this is going to be for you, I think. It's really well done. It's really well paced. It was exciting. It makes me want to read more. And I'm going to go into covering why. So hopefully you heed my words and you do this and you don't spoil the experience for yourself. But if you're like, A, I already got the book and I'm curious what you thought, Ash, or B, yeah, I'm not going to get this book no matter what. Like, I just don't. I'm just not into this stuff. But I am curious to hear what you thought of it. Then I guess proceed. Here is the alternate cover, which is kind of cool to put on the digital. I think that's the alternate cover. Or it could just be an interior cover. I don't know. I only have the digital. So, The Last God, Book 1. Here's the creators. And here's how it opens up. Every culture in Cain Anuun has a story of how the world began. None are true. And we see the vulture just eating the egg. It's not a mama bird, it's a carrion. Yet all these myths share a common element. That in the furthest east, in a land named Fellspire, there is a black stair that reaches beyond the edge of creation, out of existence and into the void itself. The people of Cain Anuun need not climb the black stair to believe in it, or in he whose will it serves. It began as a whisper, a story told by the fire through the storytellers seldom believed. The plague of flowers, a pestilence that turned the living into profanities of vine, rot, ash, and defiled flesh. The whispers rose to a resounding wail that consumed Cain Anuun. First fell Olvergolad, capital of the empire of man, then the villages of the Elven nations. The pinnacle of the guild eldritch, once thought impregnable, and the frozen strongholds of the mighty rivermen, who lay low the dragons of old. Then came the god slayers, they who, 30 years ago this day, climbed the black stair and ended the plague of flowers. See Cain Anuun, who men named the ferryman king, holy assassin and first among the Elva. See Skoll, the all-wise, who commands the mysteries of the guild eldritch. See Jorun, mightiest of Dwaros, whose mighty arm fell the terrible wrath of Kakarok. See Hakon the shamed, ageless warrior of the rivermen, once named Hakon the peerless before his heart turned black with treachery. See Sianth, our queen, mistress of the beasts, of the Ursulon, and now of the nation of men. See now the truest of them, the mortal man who slew the god in the void and saved the world entire. That day our Savior, this day our King. People of Tergalad, all hail King Tyr, God Slayer. Okay, so one of my tropes here is I always kind of read the beginning of the book here to kind of set the tone of what we're into, how it reads. So I can describe how a book reads, but you kind of need to hear the narration or the dialogue for yourself to get a true feel. I really enjoyed this opening. I had to read it twice. It was a little, not that it was weird. Well, it kind of was weird. I mean, you're reading a lot of alien elements. You don't understand what the black stare is. Some of these words, a lot of times fantasy literature. One of my things that bothers me when fantasy literature tries to make everything sound alien. Every name has to be some bizarro fantasy Dungeons and Dragons type name. If you played Dungeons and Dragons, you know what I'm talking about. No one's ever named like Charlie or George, right? They always have some weird fantasy, blah, blah, hard to pronounce name. One of the things I really like that George R. R. Martin did with his books is, he had some names like Tyrion and stuff like that, but most of the characters' names felt very grounded in real world. So it didn't feel so alien, helped you relate to it. Anyways, I'm getting off the beat. I like this symbolism here that I didn't catch the first time I read it, with the beak here and the egg. It looks like, mother bird, young, and then cracks the egg and eats it. But then you're like, it's a nest. And then it's like, is it the mother bird? And I think that it is. I think this is the mother bird eating her young. And you'll come to see why. The imagery here in this opening scene is pretty wicked. If you just like admiring the illustrations, the artist who did this work is really good. I love the illustrations here. I'm not super big on his storytelling. A lot of it just seems like illustrated pages. It doesn't seem like, it's not really great at sequential storytelling, but then the author makes up for it with the narration. And we know when you're sort of telling this backstory, it works. Now we come to see, the whole Hail the King. It's all the narration that we heard was this announcer guy. See too your honored gladiators who shed their blood to tell the tale of our heroes. If you've seen Gladiator, the movie, or if you watch Spartacus, I've heard you're just familiar with Roman gladiatorial stuff. A lot of times they would recreate stories in the gladiatorial ring. So the gladiators weren't just fighters. They were almost like actors, if you will. They were like play parts to recreate things for the people because they didn't have movies and things like that. So this was a way for there to be, sort of fictional entertainment for the fans. And so this is a gladiatorial event, which is a recreation of that famous fight. That Tyr beat the last god. And so they say, see now how Tyr faces his greatest foe. And they got this guy on this. If you look in the detail, which I like, there's all this stuff kind of in the background. If you just skim past these panels, you miss some of this detail. And you can see they got this contraption, and this guy is suspended by these cables. So he's like floating in the air with this crazy mace whip thing. And then we see, in the king's booth area, his viewing booth, most exciting, your grace. If only I had been there to witness victory myself. Was his grace as fearsome as the songs tell, my queen? And then we get to this harrowing image here where we see a crazed man, a baby, and it looks like the man wants to kill the baby. And it looks like we see like a nursemaid and the wife, just like, oh no. And this was really solid illustration here too, because you can feel the emotion and the horror in these eyes. It's really, I say that I wasn't super impressed with the sequential. Really, dog? Right now? Come here. Take off her collar so it's not jingle jangling. It's not Christmas yet. It's not jingle bells time. Yeah. All right. So you can see, what was I saying? So I was saying that the visual storytelling, the sequential storytelling wasn't the greatest, but that doesn't mean that the visual storytelling wasn't good. Obviously, like this shot here, this picture, is worth 1,000 words. This is one of my favorite images in the whole book. Not because it's the coolest, slaying some beast or anything like, some cool action scene. It's just, wow. It's so emotional. It's so visceral. It's telling. And then we pan over and we see this frame of the queen's face, and she's just sort of, oh yes. And you can see the emotion. So that's another aspect that, of course, is great for a visual storyteller to be able to capture too, not just be able to tell sequential art, but, if you can capture the emotion in the faces and things like that. Anyways, you know what I'm talking about. She responds, when you return to the Pinnacle, Guildsman, you should ask your mistress Skull about those days. Pity she could not make the journey herself as Tyr commanded, nor Jorun, or the great Vico Almun. It would have been so nice for the crowd to see the true fellowship reunited, don't you agree? And she's got this like stoic look on her face. And at first I mistook this for just kind of being wooded, like the artist failing to deliver any dynamicism. But I think it really works on second viewing that she's just playing an emotionless queen. My queen, I lady's skull is exceedingly enough. Who is this gladiator? Says the king, or asks the king. And they talk about, oh, he's a product of the slave cradles, your grace, a crowd favorite. If he wins today, he earns his freedom. His name is Evandir. Why does he not kill them? The last god falls. And the crowd is cheering, Vandir, Vandir. Evandir's 60th victory. He's known for not killing his opponents, your grace. Show of pride, I expect. Doesn't feel threatened enough to bother killing them. And he takes off his helmet. And it's kind of like really dramatic. I like this, like slow revealing his face. And everyone's hailing him. And then the king looks and he says, no. And you wonder, what's he saying no to? Is he saying no to the reveal of Evandir's, his face? Or what? You see him clutching his chest. Where are you going? Says the queen. Your grace, the ceremony is about to begin. My husband is right in all things. We will hold the ceremony without him. And then we get this reveal. Your fellows will be the rulers of Cain Anuun, exalted above all others. And even they will kneel before you until the day you see your sins made flesh. And he's staring up at this monument of the heroes that slayed the god, who apparently isn't dead. their true crown hidden by a false one of gold. No, no, not yet. And you can see it appears someone may have made a deal with the devil. And so the rest of the heroes kind of reinstate their fealty to the king, who's not even there. And here we get a little side talk. I like this. I like how they're facing forward, not looking at each other, but sort of talking while the ceremony is going on. And you can see the pointy-ear guy. This is an elven, which is obviously an analog for your typical elf. And he says, "To King Tyr and his nation of thieves, the elven nations, the true stewards of Cain Anuun, renew fealty." That's like a bit of spite coming out of his mouth. "Valko, is it?" says the queen. "1,000 elven slaves will pay for your petulance, grass eater. Ask your ferryman king if it was worth it." And he just look at him biting his, like, he's just like, "Ugh. All Turgalad is united. Yay! The god of the void is dead." The people are all cheering. "Long live the god slayers." And I loved this sort of like underbelly. There's a lot of analog to real society, corruption of governments, people in power, the blissful ignorance of people who aren't in power. And this book doesn't ever come across as political at all. I want to be clear on that. But I do like when stories like this reflect real world sociology. And a lot of our authors don't really think about sociology. And sometimes especially in fantasy worlds, a lot that's very difficult for me to get into good fantasy stories, because a lot of times authors write fantasy because they don't know how to write anything else. And in a fantasy world, you can just make up whatever you want, which is fine. But even though it's in a fantasy world, things need to make sense. I mean, humans are still humans. They still have their psychology. And when you put groups of humans together, then that's where you get sociology. These things don't just disappear because you have a fantasy world. And good fantasy writers understand that. They understand human nature, and they understand how good characters and what drives them. And they don't just, how do I say, get out of, they don't skip out by just covering it all up with fantasy mumbo jumbo. I'm kind of getting in the weeds here. I'm sorry, I'm not more eloquent. But so this slave has won his freedom with his 60th win, and the queen says, "Well struck. 60 victories is a rare feat. More so to spare your enemies in the doing. Would you ask for your freedom, as is your right?" And the slave is humble. "Milady, I've no gift for pretty words. But if he'd have me, I would serve in King Tyr's army. I would try my hand at great works, as you and him done." "Prettier words I've not heard, good Evandir. Your king would be honored to. And then you see her eyes, you see something. "Until the day you see your sins made flesh." She stares at his face, and she sees their true crown hidden by a false one of gold. So this cut off part of the ear here is telling. She seems to obviously recognize something in it. "Return him back to the slave barracks." But lady, 60 victories." "Let him win 60 more if he can." And so here we see a woman. This is a woman scorned. And now it's not ever explained in the book, but my takeaway is that the king had an affair. And this is all my speculation here. The king had an affair with an elven person. This guy here is half elven, half human, and is the king's bastard son. That's the sins made flesh. My belief is that this baby is that person, and somehow he was saved, put in the slaves. She recognized him because something happened that day. Maybe the king cut off his, sliced at his ear. I don't know. And she, of course, now is bitter to see the baby that's not hers, but her husband's, and the betrayal of her husband's. And we've seen this in the past, right? Game of Thrones kind of portrayed this mentality with, Caitlyn Stark, how she never accepted Jon Snow because he was the bastard child of another woman. So I could be misinterpreting this, but it seems to me, at least at the very least, that the writer is trying to lead the reader to think that. Maybe it's something else. Maybe we're going to have a twist. And the elven guy looks down and says, "Why do you not kill? Do men place such high values on a slave's life? Draw your blade, grass eater, and I'll show you what a slave's life is worth." And the elven just stares at him. "It is well. Play with your tin swords, if they please you." And then we see in the city a bunch of people singing song, and it's an old shanty, and la da 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 da, they're singing and they're partying and drinking, and aye, Braille, we've got an audience. Aye, big man, join us. And everyone's jolly, and you can kind of see who that big man looks like. And then we cut to this, and it's just slaughter. Oh, man. And if you're into this sort of, dark fantasy illustration of, just blood and gore and everything, just see for yourself. It's really fantastically well done. And then we cut off to other parts of the town, and we see the slaves walking away, and Elvenir's got kind of a buddy, and he's like, "I don't know how you can stomach this day. It's as Freyeth wills it. Bollocks to your god. 60 wins, that's the law. You get 60 wins, you're a freedman. It's a crime what the queen done. She's the queen. Her and King Tyr walked off the edge of the world and killed a god. It's not our place to question such as them. Gods, you've hit so much of the god slayer's swill, you actually believe it." And what's his name? God, this is why I was talking about the names. I've read his name a bunch of times, and I'm already forgetting it. Evandir. Sorry, I'm flip around. Evandir's, doesn't take. He's like, "I love you, mate, but if you speak ill of King Tyr and Queen Sianth again, I'll see you shit your teeth." It's like, oh damn. "Fine, but you earned your freedom today, mate. No matter what your queen says, I'll not fight again for such as her." And this was pretty cool. I really liked the how do I say, the adoption of the whole gladiator lore. This is like reality. Gladiators, if you study Greek or Roman history, there was an honor to them. They were slaves, but they weren't slaves in the sense that we think here in the West. Slavery oftentimes back in those days was voluntary. Sometimes slaves would put themselves voluntary into slavery to pay off debt, or things of that nature. And slaves weren't treated like, they were obviously lesser class citizens. They were slaves, but they weren't thought of as inhuman, right? They were just thought of as lower class. And the slaves understood that they were lower class, and it was just part of how society worked. It wasn't, and so some of them had a sense of honor. A lot of them were, normal people. You could stop being a slave. Being a slave wasn't based on racial, any sort of racist reasons. It was, anyways, this is different. And I really just like how they kind of captured that. I think it's an interesting part of history and society. I find sociology very interesting. And they come across this leper who's got a dog, and we can see here, and he's this, It's pretty disgusting. And he says to these guys, he's like, what does he say? Trusket for a pup, your grace? Ha, your grace. No highborns here, old girl, just slaves with nothing to give. A gift for his grace, then. Frayeth bled, a companion for the journey to come. False thy saviors, loud the dead, long the road that you must tread. No gods left whom you pray, the mother, it's eating them. And we see here the mother dog that we saw at the top of the page here in the background. And I didn't catch this the first time I read through. I mean, I caught the dog later, but I was like, whoa, there's so much detail in this book that you might miss if you skip through, if you read this too quickly, which it's easy to do. I'm guilty of that all the time. I have to catch myself and stop because I'm reading from word balloon to word balloon, and my eyes are just like boom, boom, boom. And once you start getting in that zone, you're just moving along at a nice quip, and then you stop and think, oh, wait a second, I'm not even really paying attention to the art. I'm just glancing at it enough to get a feel of what's happening, and I'm losing the pace of the story. And especially when a story has really well done art like this does, you should stop to pay attention to these expressions, to pay attention to the details in the back, like this dog who's eating all of her puppies. And it goes back to the buzzard. That was why I was saying earlier why I think that buzzard was actually eating her young. It wasn't just a prey animal. And I think this is all symbolic of the world going wrong. It's screwed up. And I think that this is symbolism trying to show of mothers eating their young is symbolic of the king kind of like, eating his people. Next thing we know, there's alarms going off. The palace is on fire. The guards call for help. And the two slave guys end up finding their way over there. And there's some banter. Where is it? Yeah. So Valko's in the scene. They're not sure like what's happened. They're kind of blaming the Elvins. Again, you have to kind of get familiar with everything. And this person right here is a guy. Yeah, that's a guy. That it's 100% drawn as a woman. Now, I guess I could forgive this because it's an elven, and I guess, if it is an analog to elves, then they are very effeminate looking in lore. So, again, in fantasy, you can kind of get away with whatever. And so this is the ferryman king that was missing. We talked about earlier in the story. And she's commanding Valko. She's like, Valko Hokatai Lua, however you pronounce that. It's the ferryman king. Vaiko Alamoon, tell your men to lay down their arms. If the ferryman were your enemy, you would have joined your brothers in the shade. We are here to protect your queen. You know not what you face. And that was... I kind of skipped some things. You can see the two gladiators are facing off against Valko. And they're like, where is the king? Tyr will be here soon with us, I think. And then crash through the ceiling. And when we see this monstrosity, that's like right out of a John Carpenter movie. And the ferryman starts doing his magic. And then we see... Evandir's buddy, please, don't, please. And he just starts getting ripped to shreds. Kono! And that's when Evandir kicks into action. He stabs one of these things. And we see the ferryman, where are the queen's chambers? South quarter, go! So there's some action. And we get to the chamber and we see King Tyr and his full glory of corruption. And it looks like, as I was saying before, he signed a deal with the devil, and the payments come due. And this is the end of the book. And we get to the end here where it's like the ferryman says, "Your king is no hero. The last god isn't dead. We have to return to the Black Stair." And we can see the queen, she's hurt, but she's still alive. And to be continued. So, obviously something's amiss. King Tyr didn't slay the god like we thought, or, like you're led to believe in the beginning. His hero group seems to be a noble group, and they were tricked along, with everyone else. And now we're going to see probably that the actual hero of the story will most likely be this character here, Evandir. And it's a good kind of opening hook to a story. At the end of the book, we get 4 pages of text. We get a page about here, Petal Black, Petal Gray, about this little song. If you're into that sort of stuff, if you love all the little details and music, and they talk about where the song comes from and everything, you might find that a little interesting. You also get Seelie, Queen of Rivers, Part 1. And you get some lore about who you find out is Cianth. This I found actually very interesting. I was reading this and I was like, geez, I want this story. Like, can we have a mini-series of this as a story? This sounds really fascinating, and it's 2 pages. And then finally we get a 4th page of what that big monolith statue was. You can kind of see here where that came from. And it kind of reminded me of the white pages in the new X books, where you get extra lore added in. And I liked how they put it at the end of the book. So it wasn't intrusive. It's not something you have to read. If you're like, I'm not interested, you don't need to. But I feel like if you enjoyed the book enough, you will want to read. You will want to read it, and you will find it enjoyable. I really enjoyed this book. It was really well done. Obviously, in my presentation of it, isn't there to be as dramatic and give you the same feel. So if you haven't read this book, you may not get the same sense that I am. By the way, I set my iPad, this is a side note, to only have notifications for YouTube. So I thought it'd be interesting, because I was sick of getting interrupted in my videos, but I was like, if I get interrupted by viewers who are leaving me comments, I think that's pretty cool, especially if viewers then later on see their comments pop up. So if you happen to leave a comment while I'm recording, you'll know, because you'll see it later on and pop up in a video. But that's all for this book. I really, like I said, I encourage you, if you're into this sort of stuff, hopefully you didn't let me spoil this. If you have read it, tell me what your thoughts were. Did you get the same take of the book as I did? Did you have that same enjoyment? Did you feel the pacing was right on, that suspense, that sort of, the reveal wasn't exactly like, the Kaiser Sose reveal of Usual Suspects, where you're just like mind blow. You almost kind of see it coming, but it still feels like a satisfying reveal. The only thing that bothered me about it is that it seemed very copycatish of another book that I've read that I won't mention what it is, because I don't want to spoil anything else for you. But there's other books out there, and I was like, this feels like this other book did the same thing as that. But be that as it may, good is good. This book is good. It's excellent, and I can't recommend it highly enough to fans of this sort of genre. And even if you're not, even if you're kind of like me, where you're just like, well, fantasy can be okay when it's well done, but it's not normally my cup of tea, this still might be for you. This is, like I said, good is good, and this book is excellent. So this is Ash on Comics you're watching. In case you forgot, I'm Ash. I appreciate you watching this far, and we'll see you next time.